Continuing with Hannibal via Livy, being Livy's book 23, picking up section 26. Such were the activities and preparations in Italy. Meanwhile, in Spain, the war was no less intense. But to that point, it was more successful for the Romans. Publius and Gnaeus Scipio had divided their troops, Gnaeus taking charge of land operations and Publius those at sea. The Carthaginian commander, Hasdrubal, however, had little confidence in either branch of his forces and gave his enemy a wide berth, using distance and position to protect himself, until finally, in response to his urgent and repeated requests, he was sent reinforcements of 4,000 infantry and 500 cavalry from Africa. With that, his hopes finally revived. He moved camp closer to the enemy, and he, too, issued orders for a fleet to be prepared and equipped to protect the islands and the mainland coast. Just as he was thrusting ahead with his renewed operations, he was thrown off balance by the desertion of his naval captains. These had received a serious reprimand from him after they panicked and abandoned the fleet at the Ebro. And since then, they had never been completely loyal either to their commander or the Carthaginian cause. The deserters had fomented unrest amongst the Tartessi, a number of whose cities had, thanks to their efforts, seceded from the Carthaginians, and one they had even taken by storm. Hasdrubal now directed hostilities against the tribe instead of the Romans, and with an invading army entered the territory of his enemy. He decided to make an attack on Chalbus, a celebrated chieftain of the Tartessi, who was now encamped with a powerful force before the walls of a city that he had captured a few days earlier. Hasdrubal sent forward his light infantry to draw the enemy into battle, and dispatched a section of his cavalry to conduct predatory raids throughout the countryside and to round up stragglers. At one and the same moment, there was agitation in the enemy camp, and flight and slaughter throughout the surrounding countryside. Presently, however, the Tartessi returned to camp by various routes from every direction, and fear suddenly vanished from their minds, and now had enough courage not only to defend their fortifications, but even to launch an offensive against their enemy. They burst from their camp in a column, performing their traditional war dance, and this sudden display of bravado struck terror into the enemy that was on the attack shortly before. Accordingly, Hasdrubal himself withdrew his troops to a hill that was quite steep, and further protected a river flowing before it, and he also pulled back to the same spot the light army infantry that he had sent ahead, and the cavalry that were scattered through the countryside. In addition, having little confidence in the protection offered by either hill or river, he strengthened his camp with a palisade. As the panic swung from one side to the other, there were a number of clashes. In these, the Numidian cavalryman proved no match for his Spanish counterpart, nor the Moorish javelin thrower for the Quechua-armed soldier. Their enemies equal in agility, The Spanish troops were considerably superior in determination and physical strength. 27. The Tartessi were unable to draw the Carthaginian into combat by moving up close to his camp, and an assault on the camp was not going to be easy. They therefore stormed the city of Ascua, where Hasdrubal had deposited his grain and other provisions on entering enemy territory, and took possession of all the surrounding countryside. After that, the Spaniards could be restrained by no authority, whether on the march or in camp. Hasdrubal took note of this common phenomenon. The carelessness followed on the heels of success. He urged his men to launch an attack on the enemy while they were straggling and out of formation, and, descending the hill, he proceeded to march on their camp in battle order. Word of his approach was brought by messengers, who came running back in panic from lookout stations and sentinel posts, and the call to arms went up. Snatching up weapons as they came to hand, the Tartessi rushed into the fray without orders, without waiting a signal, and in total disarray and confusion. When the first comers had already engaged, others were still running up in separate groups, and yet others had not even left the camp. Even so, their bravado alone at first unnerved their enemy, but the Tartessi were coming in small bands against men formed in ranks, and their small numbers gave them no protection. They all began to look for assistance from their comrades, and, under pressure from every side, formed a circle. As bodies jostled with bodies and weapons engaged with weapons, they were driven together into a confined space where they had scarcely enough room to wield their arms. Completely encircled by the enemy, they were subjected to wholesale slaughter till late in the day, and only an insignificant number managed to break out and head for the woods and hills. In the same panic, the camp was abandoned, and the following day the entire tribe capitulated. But the Tartessi did not long abide by the terms of surrender. Shortly after the battle, Hasdrubal received an order from Carthage to lead his army into Italy at the earliest opportunity, and when news of that spread through Spain, it diverted the support of almost all the tribes from the Carthaginians to the Romans. Hasdrubal therefore immediately sent a letter to Carthage, in which he made it known how much harm rumors of his departure had done. If he did in fact leave, he said Spain would be in Roman hands before he crossed the Ebro. Apart from the fact that he had no military force or commander to leave in his place, he explained the quality of the Roman generals was such that opposition would scarcely be possible, even if the two sides had equal strength. Accordingly, they should send him a successor with a powerful army, if Spain meant anything to them. But even if all went well for that man, Hasdrubal concluded, he would not find his charge an easy one. "28. The letter at first made a deep impression on the Carthaginian Senate. However, Italy was the first and more urgent priority, and no change was made with respect to Hasdrubal and his forces. Instead, Hamilcar was dispatched with a complete army and an enlarged fleet to hold and protect Spain by land and sea. After taking his land and naval forces over to Spain, Hamilcar established a fortified camp, beached his ships, and surrounded them with a palisade. Then he personally took some of his elite cavalry and made his way to Hasdrubal, with all the speed he could muster, equally vigilant as he passed through tribes of dubious loyalty, and those that were openly hostile. Hamilcar acquainted Hasdrubal with the decrees and instructions of their senate, and was in turn informed of how the war in Spain should be handled. He had returned to his camp, his safety secured by his speed, more than anything else, since he got away from each area before its inhabitants could agree on a plan of action. Before striking camp, Hasdrubal levied funds from all the tribes in his jurisdiction. He was well aware that Hannibal had occasionally used money to secure a passage, that it was only by hire that he had raised his Gallic auxiliary troops, and that he would barely have made it as far as the Alps had he started his immense journey without funds. Hasdrubal therefore hurriedly levied monies before marching down to the Ebro. When word of the Carthaginian decrees and Hasdrubal's march reached the Romans, the two commanders dropped everything else, joined forces, and prepared to oppose and thwart their enemy's designs. Hannibal was an enemy that Italy could barely resist when he was operating on his own, they thought, and if he were joined by a general like Hasdrubal and by an army from Spain, that would spell the end of the power of Rome. Gripped by worries such as this, they brought their forces together at the Ebro. After crossing the river, they long debated whether to bring their camp closer to Hasdrubal's, or whether it would suffice for them to delay the enemy's projected march by launching attacks on Carthaginian allies. They finally prepared to attack what was at that time the richest city in the region, Hiberia, which was named after the nearby river. When Hasdrubal heard about this, instead of bringing assistance to his allies, he chose rather to proceed himself with an attack on a town that had recently surrendered to the Romans. The blockade of Hiberia, which had already commenced, was therefore abandoned by the Romans, whose operations were now focused directly on Hasdrubal himself. 29. The two sides had their camps 5 miles apart from each other for a number of days, and while there were some minor skirmishes, they avoided pitched battle. Finally, almost as if by agreement, the signal for battle was hoisted on both sides on the very same day, and they both went down to the plain in full force. The Roman army stood there, lines deep. Some of the skirmishers were positioned amongst the front-line troops, and others behind the standards, while the cavalry covered the flanks. Hasdrubal strengthened his center with Spanish troops. On the flanks, he placed Carthaginians on the right, and Africans along with mercenary auxiliaries on the left. His cavalry he positioned on the wings, setting the Numidian horse alongside the Carthaginian infantry, and the others beside the Africans. Not all of the Numidians were placed on the right wing, however. Only those whose practice it was to take 2 horses apiece, and, like circus performance, jump fully armed from a weary mount to a fresh one, often when the fighting was at its most fierce. Such is the agility of these horsemen, and so trainable this breed of horse. As the two sides stood drawn up in this manner, their commanders differed little in terms of confidence. In numbers or quality of men, one side was not in the slightest superior to the other, but the morale of the soldiers was very different. Although the Romans were fighting far from home, their officers had found it easy to persuade them that their fight was for Italy and the city of Rome. For them, their return home turned upon the outcome of the battle, and they had resolutely decided to win or die. The other army consisted of men less resolute. Most were Spaniards, and they preferred to face defeat in Spain rather than win and be dragged to Italy. The result was that, at the very first clash, and when the javelins had barely been thrown, the Carthaginian centre gave ground, and, as the Romans came bearing down on them with a powerful charge, they took to their heels. The engagement was no less intense on the wings. Here there was heavy pressure from the Carthaginians on one side, and the Africans on the other, and these, having virtually encircled the Romans, were engaging them on the two fronts. But by then the Roman line had entirely converged on the center, and so had sufficient strength to push back the wings on either side. Thus there were two separate battles in progress, and in both there was no doubt as to the superiority of the Romans, who, after the enemy's center was driven back, had the edge in the numbers as well as the strength of their men. The casualties of the battle were extremely heavy, and very few would have survived from the entire enemy fighting line but for the wild fight of the Spaniards when the battle had barely got under way. As for cavalry action, there was hardly any. As soon as the Moors and the Numidians saw the center give way, they immediately took to headlong flight, driving the elephants before them, and left the wings without protection. Hasdrubal waited to see the final outcome of the engagement, and then he too slipped away from the midst of the slaughter with a few companions. The Romans captured and sacked the enemy camp. The battle brought over to the Romans any wavering elements that remained in Spain, and left Hasdrubal with no hope not merely of taking his army across into Italy, but even by remaining in Spain with any kind of security. These events were made known in Rome by a dispatch from the Scipios, and the ensuing rejoicing was less over the victory than the fact that Hasdrubal's passage into Italy had been stopped. 30. While this was going on in Spain, Petelia, the town in Bruttium, fell to Hannibal's lieutenant Himilco, after a siege that had begun some months earlier. That victory cost the Carthaginians dear in blood and injuries, and their presence that brought the beleaguered townspeople to their knees was that of hunger more than anything else. After exhausting their supplies of grain, as well as meat, from every kind of quadruped, conventional food or not, they finally kept themselves alive by eating leather, grass, roots, the soft parts of tree bark, and strips of leaves. It was only when they lacked the strength to man the walls and bear arms that they were finally vanquished. After taking Petelia, the Carthaginian led his forces over to Consentia, and as this was defended with less resolve, he accepted its surrender in a matter of days. At about this time, a Bruttian army also laid siege to the Greek city of Croton. This had once been a powerful and populous town, but it had by now been so devastated by many brutal reverses that it was left with fewer than 2,000 citizens all told. As a result, the enemy easily took possession of the city, devoid of defenders. Only the citadel remained in the citizens' hands. In the confusion following the capture of the town, a number fled there from the slaughter surrounding them. In addition, Locri defected to the Bruti, and the Carthaginians, the common people having been betrayed by the aristocrats. In that part of the country only Rhegium maintained its loyalty to the Romans, and its own independence to the end. The same backsliding reached Sicily too, where not even Hiero's family was untouched by defection. Gello, eldest of Hiero's children, felt only contempt for his father's advanced years, and also following the defeat at Cannae, for the alliance with Rome, and he transferred his allegiance to the Carthaginians. Gello would in fact have fomented rebellion in Sicily, had not his timely death, so timely as to taint even the father with suspicion, removed him as he was busy arming the commons and sowing disaffection amongst the Roman allies. Such were that year's events and their varied outcomes in Italy, Africa, Sicily, and Spain. At the end of the year, Quintus Fabius Maximus asked the Senate's permission to dedicate to Venus Eryx, the temple that he had promised in a vow when he was dictator. The Senate decided that the consul designate, Tiberius Sempronius, should, when he entered office, propose to the people that Quintus Fabius be appointed a duumvir for the dedication of the temple. Also that year, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who had been consul and an augur, was honored by his 3 sons, Lucius Marcus and Quintus, with funeral games lasting 3 days, including 22 pairs of gladiators put on display in the forum. The curule aediles, Gaius Latorius and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a consul designate who had been master of horse during his aedileship, celebrated the Roman games, 3 days of which were repeated. The plebeian games, put on by Marcus Aurelius Cotta and Marcus Claudius Marcellus, were repeated 3 times. The year of the Punic War was now at an end, and on the 15th of March, Tiberius Sempronius entered office as consul. As their jurisdictions, the praetors gained by lot the following: Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, former consul and censor; urban jurisdiction, Marcus Valerius Lavinus, jurisdiction over foreigners; Appius Claudius Pulcher, Sicily, and Quintus Mutius Scaevola, Sardinia. The people vested Marcus Marcellus with proconsular imperium because he alone of Roman commanders had operated successfully in Italy after the defeat of Cannae. 31. On the first day of its session on the Capitol, the Senate decreed double taxation for that year, with the regular taxes levied immediately, so that from them a cash payment could be made to all soldiers apart from those who had served at Cannae. As for disposition of the armies, the senators decided that the consul Tiberius Sempronius should fix a date for the muster of the 2 urban legions at Calais, from where they were to be marched to the Castra Claudiana above Susula. The legions already in place there, principally soldiers from the army at Cannae, were to be transferred to Sicily by the praetor Appius Claudius Pulcher, and those in Sicily would be shipped to Rome. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was sent to the army that was scheduled to muster at Calais, and he was under orders to lead the urban legions to the Castra Claudiana. Tiberius Massilius Croto was dispatched by Appius Claudius as his legate to take charge of the old army and conduct it from the Castra Claudiana to Sicily. At first, people had said nothing as they waited for the consul to hold elections for the appointment of his colleague. Then they saw Marcus Marcellus removed from the scene as though on purpose, and he was the man they particularly wanted as consul that year because of his successful record in his praetorship. A murmuring now arose in the Senate. Hearing this, the consul remarked, both decisions were in the interest of the state, members of the Senate. It is beneficial, first, for Marcus Claudius to leave for Campania, to see to the exchange of troops, and secondly, for the elections not to be scheduled until he has come home after finishing the business assigned to him. Thus you may have the consul the state needs at the moment, and the one you want most. And so talk of elections was silenced until Marcellus's return. Meanwhile, Quintus Fabius Maximus and Titus Audacilius Crassus were appointed duumvirs for the dedication of temples, Audacilius for the temple of Mens, and Fabius for the temple of Venus of Erox. Both of them are on the Capitol, separated by a single drainage channel. In addition, a proposal was put before the people to grant Roman citizenship to 300 Capuan knights who had come to Rome after loyal service in Sicily. It was further proposed that these should enjoy the rights of townspeople of Cumae, dating from the day before the people of Capua defected from the Roman people. The prime impetus behind the proposal was the knights' own assertion that they did not know the class to which they belonged. They had abandoned the city that had been their home, but had not yet been granted formal admission to the one to which they had now come on their return to Italy. On Marcellus's return from the army, notice was given of an election to appoint a single consul as a replacement for Lucius Postumius. Marcellus was elected with an overwhelming majority, and he was to take office immediately. But there was a peal of thunder at the moment of his entering his consulship, and when the augurs were summoned, they declared that there appeared to be something amiss with his election. The patricians thereupon spread the word that the gods were displeased at the precedent-setting election of 2 plebeian consuls at the same time. Marcellus withdrew from office, to be replaced by Quintus Fabius Maximus, now consul for the 3rd time. The sea caught fire that year, and in the area of Sinuessa a cow gave birth to a foal. Statues near the temple of Juno Sospita in Lanuvium dripped blood, and around the precinct stones fell as rain. There were the customary 9 days of religious observances because of this shower, and expiatory rites were attentively discharged for the other prodigies. 32. The consuls were divided the armies between them. The consuls now divided the armies between them, that at Tenium, formerly under the dictator Marcus Junius, fell to Fabius, and to Sempronius at Rome, fell to the slave volunteers stationed there, and 25,000 allied troops. The legions that had returned from Sicily were officially assigned to the praetor Marcus Valerius. Marcus Claudius was sent as a proconsul to the army stationed above Sassuola for the defense of Nola, and the praetors went off to Sicily and Sardinia. The consuls issued a proclamation that whenever they convened the Senate, senators and all having the right to express an opinion in the House should come together at the Porta Capena. The praetors charged with administration of justice established their tribunals at the Piscina Publica. It was here they ordered that litigants had to undertake to make their court appearance, and it was the city's legal center during that year. Meanwhile, at Carthage, Hannibal's brother Mago was on the point of shipping to Italy 12,000 infantry, 1,500 cavalry, 20 elephants, and 1,000 talents of silver, with an escort of 60 warships. Then news reached the city of the reverse in Spain, and of the almost complete defection to the Romans of the tribes in the province. There was some suggestion that they should forget Italy and redirect Mago with that fleet and armament to Spain. But then came a sudden flicker of hope that Sardinia could be recovered. It was reported that the Roman army in Sardinia was small, and that the old praetor Aulus Cornelius, who knew the province well, was leaving. A fresh replacement was expected. In addition to this, the Sardinians were tired of Roman dominion, which had gone on for so long. During the past year, they had found the administration harsh and rapacious, and they were also burdened with an oppressive tribute and an unfair grain levy. All that was needed was a leader to whom they could defect. The information had been covertly transmitted to Carthage by some leading Sardinian citizens, the prime mover in the affair being Sicura, who at that time far surpassed the others in influence and wealth. These two reports brought anxiety and elation to the Carthaginians almost at the same time. They dispatched Mago to Spain with his fleet and his troops, but they also selected Hasdrubal as commander for Sardinia, and assigned to him a force of roughly the same proportions as the one they had assigned to Mago. At Rome, too, where all necessary dispositions within the city had been made, the consuls were now preparing for the campaign. Tiberius Sempronius officially gave his soldiers a date for muster at Sinussa, and after first consulting the Senate, Quintus Fabius ordered the general transportation of grain from the countryside into fortified towns before the coming 1st of June. In the case of anyone failing to effect the transportation, he said he would lay waste the man's land, auction off his slaves, and burn his farm buildings. Not even the praetors voted into office for legal duties were granted exemption from military administration. The praetor Valerius, it was decided, should proceed to Apulia to assume command of the army of Terentius. When the legions from Sicily arrived, Valerius was to rely mainly on them for the defense of that region, and the army of Terentius was to be sent to Tarentum under one of his lieutenants. He was also assigned 25 ships to enable him to give protection to the coastline between Brundisium and Tarentum. The same number of ships was allocated to the urban praetor Quintus Fulvius for the protection of the shores close to the city. The proconsul Gaius Terentius was given the duty of levying troops in the territory of Picenum and of defending that area. Finally, after his dedication of the Temple of Mens on the Capitol, Titus Audacilius Crassus was dispatched to Sicily with imperium to assume command of the fleet. 33. This was a struggle between the two most prosperous nations in the world, and all rulers and nations had their attention focused on it. These included King Philip of Macedon, who was all the more concerned for being closer to Italy, with only the Ionian Sea separating him from it. As soon as he got wind of Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, he had been overjoyed at the outbreak of war between Rome and Carthage. But he had also been unsure, their relative strengths being still unknown, which of the two peoples he wished to see prevail. Now, after the third battle had been fought, and the third victory had gone to Carthage, he leaned towards success and sent emissaries to Hannibal. The emissaries avoided the ports of Brundisium and Tarentum, since they were occupied and guarded by Roman ships, and disembarked instead near the temple of Juno Lacinia. From there, they headed towards Apulia, towards Capua, only to fall in with some Roman patrols, by whom they were escorted to the praetor Valerius Lavinius, then encamped in the neighborhood of Luceria. There the leader of the delegation, Xenophanes, boldly stated that he was on a mission from King Philip, the aim of which was to establish a treaty of friendship with the Roman people. He added that he had dispatches to convey to the consuls and the Senate and people of Rome, with old allies succeeding from Rome. The praetor was delighted at the prospect of a new alliance with such an illustrious king, and he gave his enemies the warm welcome accorded to guests. He provided them with an escort and supplied detailed information about their itinerary, indicating the areas and passes held by either the Romans or the enemy. Xenophanes came through the Roman post into Campania, and from there reached Hannibal's camp by the shortest route. Here he struck a treaty of friendship with the Carthaginian, the terms of which were as follows. King Philip was to cross to Italy with the largest fleet he could possibly muster. It seemed likely that he would put together 200 ships, and there lay waste the coast, and conduct land and sea operations to the best of his ability. At the war's end, all Italy, together with the actual city of Rome, was to be the possession of the Carthaginians, and Hannibal, and all the plunder was to go to Hannibal. With Italy conquered, the Allies were to sail to Greece and open hostilities against any peoples the king might choose. City-states on the mainland and islands off Macedonia would belong to Philip and his realm. "34. Such, in essence, were the terms of the treaty struck between the Carthaginian leader and the Macedonian delegates, and Carthaginian spokesmen, Gisgo Bostar and Mago, were then sent along with the delegates to have the agreement ratified by the king himself. They came to that same spot near the temple of Juno, Lacinia, where the ship lay at anchor hidden from view. They cast off, but while they were heading out to sea, they were sighted by the Roman fleet that was patrolling the coastal areas of Calabria, and Valerius Flaccus then sent some skiffs to give chase to the ship and bring it back. At first, the king's representatives attempted to run, but when they saw they were being overtaken, they surrendered to the Romans and were brought before the admiral of the fleet. Flaccus asked their identity, where they had come from, and where they were headed. Xenophanes at first proceeded with the fiction that had already served him well on one occasion. He was on a mission from Philip to the Romans, he said, and had made it as far as Marcus Valerius, the only person he could reach in safety. He had been unable to get across Campania because it was blocked by enemy guard posts. Then the Carthaginians' dress and appearance raised suspicions about Hannibal's emissaries, and when these were interrogated, their accent gave them away. After this, their attendants were taken aside and subjected to intimidating threats, and a letter from Hannibal to Philip also came to light, along with the text of the agreements made between the Macedonian king and the Carthaginian leader. The facts being sufficiently established, it seemed best to send the prisoners and their attendants to the Senate in Rome as soon as possible, or, alternatively, to the councils, wherever they happened to be. 5 swift ships were picked out for this mission, and Lucius Valerius Antius was sent to take command. Antius was instructed to distribute the emissaries amongst all his vessels, have them guarded separately, and generally do what he could to prevent any conversation or exchange of ideas amongst them. It was at this time that Aulus Cornelius Mamula, who was retiring from his province of Sardinia, made his report in Rome about the state of affairs on the island. The entire population had its mind set on war and rebellion, he said. His successor, Quintus Mutius, had on his arrival fallen prey to the oppressive climate and bad water, and had contracted a sickness which, while not life-threatening, would be of long duration. This, said Mamula, would put him out of action for military duties for quite some time, and in addition, the army on the island, while strong enough to police a province that was at peace, was too small for the war that seemed likely to break out. The senators therefore decided that Fulvius Flaccus should levy 5,000 infantry and 400 cavalry, and have this legion shipped to Sardinia as soon as possible. Flaccus was also to send a man of his own choosing, furnished with imperium, to take command until Mucius recovered. The man sent on this assignment was Titus Manlius Torquatus. Twice consul, Torquatus had also been a censor, and had crushed the Sardinians during one of his consulships. At about the same time, a fleet had also been dispatched to Sardinia from Carthage, commanded by Hasdrubal, surnamed Calvus. This had been overtaken by bad weather and driven off course towards the Balearic Islands. The ship's hulls, as well as the rigging, had received extensive damage, and so the ships were hauled ashore and the repairs entailed a considerable loss of time. 35. In Italy, the war was flagging after the Battle of Cannae. One side's strength was shattered, and the other's morale had been sapped. At this juncture, the people of Capua made an independent effort to bring Cumae under their control. First, they invited the people of Cumae to secede from Rome, and then little came of that. They devised a scheme for trapping them. There was at regular intervals a pan-Campanian festival at Cumae. The Capuans informed the people of Cumae that the Capuan Senate would be in attendance, and they invited the Cumaean Senate to attend as well, so they should hold joint discussions on how the two peoples could have the same allies and the same enemies. They added that they would have a military presence there to meet any threat from the Romans or the Carthaginians. The Cumaeans suspected that treachery was afoot, but made no objection, thinking that in this way they could have cover for a ruse of their own. Meanwhile, the Roman consul, Tiberius Sempronius, had conducted a review of his army at Sinuessa, where he had scheduled the muster of his troops. He then crossed the river Volturnus and encamped near Litterdum. There was too much free time in camp, and Sempronius insisted on frequent drills for his men so that the new recruits, most of them slave volunteers, could gain experience in following the standards and recognizing their place in the ranks in battle. During the drills, the leader was particularly concerned, and the orders he had given the legates and tribunes were to this effect, that no uncomplimentary remarks about anyone's erstwhile status should sow discord in the ranks. The veteran should allow himself to be put on the same level as the new recruit, the free man on the same level as the slave volunteer, he said. They should regard all men to whom the Roman people had entrusted its arms and standards as having rank and pedigree enough, and the same unfortunate circumstances that had made such measures necessarily compelled them to respect them now they were in place. The men were as punctilious in observing these rules as the officers were in enforcing them, and in a short while such harmony had been established amongst the entire force that what each man's background had been upon his becoming a soldier was well nigh forgotten. While Gracchus was thus engaged, he received from Cumaean envoys a report on the delegation that had come from the Capuans a few days earlier, and of the reply that the Cumaeans had given. The festival was 3 days away, they said, and not only would their entire senate be present, but there would also be a Capuan army encamped there. Gracchus instructed the Cumaeans to bring everything into the city from the fields, and to remain inside their walls. And on the day before that, fixed for the Campanian rite, he himself moved his camp to Cumae. Hamae lies some 3 miles from Cumae. As agreed, the Capuans had gathered there in large numbers, but not far away. Marius Alpheus, their Medix Tuticus, the chief Capuan magistrate, was secretly encamped with 14,000 soldiers, but Alpheus was considerably more focused on preparations for the rite and on setting the trap during the preparations than he was with fortifying the camp or any other military employment. It was a nocturnal rite, but one that was to be completed before the middle of the night. That thought Gracchus was the point at which to bring off his coup. He set guards at the camp gates to prevent anyone from leaking information on his design, and after the 10th hour of daylight brought his men together. He told them to take refreshment and see to it that they got some sleep, so that they could assemble when the signal was given at dusk. Then at about the first watch he ordered the standards raised, and set off his column maintaining silence. Reaching Hamae in the middle of the night, he made an attack on the Capuan camp. Through all its gates, at the same moment, it was poorly guarded, as one might expect during a festival celebrated at night. Some he slaughtered as they lay sleeping, others as they were returning unarmed from the completed rite. The death toll from the nocturnal melee surpassed 2,000 and included the commander, Marius Alpheus, himself, sharp brackets, and 34 military standards, sharp brackets, were captured. The sharp brackets indicate not knowing the exact number. 36. Gracchus took the enemy camp with the loss of fewer than 100 men, and then beat a hasty retreat to Cumae, for he felt uneasy about Hannibal, who was encamped in the Tifata mountains above Capua. His premonition did not prove incorrect. As soon as news of the debacle reached Capua, Hannibal surmised that he would find at Hamae an army of fresh recruits, slaves for the most part, gloating over their success and busy stripping the bodies of the vanquished and driving off the captured animals. He therefore took his army at a rapid pace past Capua, issuing orders for Campanian fugitives, that he met en route to be taken to Capua with an escort, and the wounded transported to the town on wagons. Hannibal himself then came to Hamae, where he found the camp abandoned by the enemy, and nothing more than vestiges of the recent massacre, the corpses of his allies strewn everywhere. There were some who recommended that he march directly to Cumae and attack the town. This Hannibal passionately wished to do. With Cumae, he would at least have a coastal city at his disposition, something he had not been able to manage with Neapolis. However, because of the rapid pace of the march, his men had brought with them nothing but their weapons, and so he withdrew once more to his camp on Tifata. Then the next day, overwhelmed by the pleas of the Campanians, he returned from the camp to Cumae, bringing with him all the equipment necessary for attacking a city. He laid waste to the Cumaean farmlands and pitched camp a mile from the city. Gracchus, meanwhile, remained in Cumae, and this was more because he was ashamed to leave his allies in such a desperate plight. Allies who were begging for his protection and that of the Roman people, then because he had any great confidence in his army. Again. Gracchus, meanwhile, remained in Cumae, and this was more because he was ashamed to leave his allies in such a desperate plight. Allies who were begging for his protection and that of the Roman people, than because he had any great confidence in his army. The other consul, Fabius, who was encamped at Calais, would not risk taking his army across the river Volturnus either. He was preoccupied with retaking the auspices in the first place, but then also with prodigies, reports of which were streaming in one after the other. As Fabius performed the expiatory sacrifices for these, the soothsayers kept reporting that favorable signs were not easy to obtain. 37. Such were the circumstances that kept Fabius in place, and meanwhile Sempronius was facing a blockade and siege works that were now proceeding against him. A massive wooden tower had been brought up to the city, and to fend this off, the Roman consul erected another tower on the wall itself. This was somewhat higher than the enemy's. The wall was quite high in itself, and Sempronius had used it as a base, bracing it with strong wooden piles. From this structure, the defenders at first defended the walls and the city by hurling down stones, stakes, and other projectiles. Eventually, they saw that their enemy was pushing forward their tower and brought it into contact with the wall, and they now set it on fire at several points simultaneously by hurling flaming torches at it. The blaze spread panic amongst the crowd of soldiers on the enemy tower, who flung themselves down from it. At this point, too, there was a counterattack launched from the two gates of the town at the same time. This scattered the forward post of the enemy and sent them fleeing back to camp, so that on that day the Carthaginians appeared more like the besieged than the besiegers. The Carthaginian death toll was around 1,300, and 59 were taken alive. These were men who had been taken by surprise, when they were at ease and off guard, close to the walls and at their post, and fearing anything but a counterattack. Before the enemy had time to recover from their sudden panic, Gracchus signaled the retreat and brought his men back within the walls. The following day, Hannibal assumed that the consul's success would leave him to fight a pitched battle, and so he marshaled his line between the camp and the city. However, when he saw no movement from their usual defensive position, and nothing being staked on foolhardy hopes, he returned to the Tifata mountains with nothing achieved. During the very same time that the siege of Cumae was raised, Tiberius Sempronius, who was surnamed Longus, also fought a successful engagement against the Carthaginian Hanno, near Grumentum in Lucania. Sempronius killed upwards of 2,000 men, losing 280 of his soldiers in the process, and captured about 41 military standards. Driven out of Lucanian territory, Hanno retired into that of the Brutii. 3 towns of the Hirpini that had revolted from the Roman people, Vercellium, and Cecilinum, were also recaptured by the praetor Marcus Valerius, and the ringleaders of the revolt were beheaded. More than 5,000 prisoners of war were auctioned off. The rest of the booty was left to the rank and file, and the army was marched back to Luceria. 38. In the course of these operations amongst the Lucanians and the Hirpini, the 5 ships that were taking the captured Macedonian and Carthaginian emissaries to Rome had skirted practically the whole of the Italian coastline on their journey from the Adriatic to the Tyrrhenian Sea. As they passed Cumae, under sail, one could not tell for sure whether they were enemy or allied vessels, and Gracchus sent some ships from his fleet to intercept them. In the course of the questions that each party put to the other, it was established that the consul was at Cumae. The ships accordingly put in at Cumae, and the prisoners were escorted to the consul, who was also given the documents they had been carrying. After reading the correspondence between Philip and Hannibal, the consul sent all the documents overlain to the Senate under seal, but ordered the emissaries to be transported by sea. The letters and emissaries reached Rome almost on the same day, and an interrogation found the men's statements to be in line with the documents. At first the senators were seriously worried. They could see on the horizon a war of massive proportions with Macedon, at a time when they could barely cope with the Punic War. But they certainly did not knuckle under, and in fact their immediate topic for discussion was how they could deflect the enemy from Italy by actually taking the offensive. The senators ordered the prisoners to be clapped in irons, and they sold off their attendants at auction. They next issued a decree ordering that the further 25 ships be equipped to add to the 25 under the command of the prefect Publius Valerius Flaccus. The new vessels were brought together and launched, and to them were added the 5 that had brought the captured emissaries. The 30 ships then set sail from Ostia for Tarentum. There Publius Valerius was instructed to take on board the troops of Varro, who were stationed at Tarentum under the command of the legate Lucius Apustius, and with this combined fleet of 55 ships to patrol the Italian coastline, and also gather intelligence on the possibility of war with Macedon. If Philip's project squared with the letters and the data supplied by the emissaries, Publius Valerius was to impart this information by letter to the praetor Marcus Valerius. Valerius was then to leave the legate Lucius Apustius in command of the army, proceed to the fleet at Tarentum, and at the earliest opportunity cross the Macedonia, where he was to do all he could to keep Philip within the confines of his realm. Moneys had been sent to Appius Claudius in Sicily to be repaid to King Hiero, but these were now transferred by decree to the maintenance of the fleet and to the war with Macedon. The cash was transported to Tarentum by the legate Lucius Antistius, and at the same time 200,000 measures of wheat and 100,000 measures of barley were sent by Hiero. 39. While the Romans were taking these preparatory measures, one of the captured Carthaginian vessels that had been sent to Rome with the other ships slipped away from its course and fled to Philip, who was thus made aware of the capture of his emissaries and the letters. The king did not know what understanding had been reached between his own emissaries and Hannibal, or what proposals Hannibal's emissaries had been going to bring to him, and so he sent off a second deputation with the same instructions as before. The emissaries went to Hannibal, where Heraclitus, who was nicknamed Scotinus, the Boeotian Crito, and Magnesian Sositheus. They were actually successful in taking and bringing back their messages, but the summer came to an end before the king could react or take any initiative. So crucial was the capture of one vessel carrying diplomats for postponing a war that threatened the Romans. Around Capua, meanwhile, Fabius had crossed the Vulturnus after finally completing the expiatory rites for the prodigies and the two consuls were now acting in concert. Fabius forced into submission the towns of Combulteria, Tribulia, and Osticula, which had gone over to the Carthaginians, and members of Hannibal's garrisons and large numbers of companions were taken prisoner in them. At Nola, the Senate was pro-Roman, and the Commons pro-Hannibal, as the year before, and there were covert plots to murder the leading citizens and betray the city. Again, at Nola, the Senate was pro-Roman, and the Commons pro-Hannibal, as the year before, and there were covert plans to murder the leading citizens and betray the city. To forestall such plans, Fabius took his army on a course between Capua and Hannibal's camp on the Tafada mountains, and ensconced himself above Susula in the Castra Claudiana. From there he dispatched to Nola the propraetor Marcus Marcellus, together with the forces under Marcellus's command, to garrison the town. In Sardinia, military operations had been suspected after the praetor Quintus Mucius succumbed to his serious disease, but these were now reopened under the command of the praetor Titus Manlius. Manlius hauled his warships ashore at Corales, and furnished the crews with arms, so he could fight on the land. With these, and the army that he received from the praetor Mucius, he made up a force of 22,000 foot and 1,200 horse. At the head of each cavalry and infantry troops, he set out into enemy territory, pitching his camp a short distance from Hampsicoras. It so happened that Hampsicora had at that point left on a journey to Pelati Sardinians, intended to arm their young men and thereby augment his forces, and his son, who was called Hostus, was in command of the camp, youthfully headstrong. Hostus recklessly committed to battle, and was defeated and routed. Some 3,000 Sardinians were killed in the battle, and about 800 taken alive. The rest of the army at first dispersed in flight through the fields and forest, but then sought refuge in the regional capital, a city called Cornus, to which, it was rumored, their leader had made his escape. That battle might have marked the end of the war in Sardinia, but for the timely arrival of the Carthaginian fleet under Hasdrubal's command. This had been driven off course to the Balearic Islands by bad weather, but now arrived at a good time to raise hopes of recommencing hostilities. On receiving word of the docking of the Punic fleet, Manlius withdrew to Corales, thus giving Hampsicoria the opportunity of joining up with the Carthaginians. Hasdrubal disembarked his troops, sent the fleet back to Carthage, and set off, guided by Hampsicora, to plunder the farmlands of allies of the Roman people. He would have reached Corales had not Manlius confronted him with his army and put a stop to his widespread pillaging. Initially, the two camps simply faced each other a short distance apart, and then there were some sudden charges that provoked minor skirmishes, with varying results. Finally, they took to the field. Clashing in pitched battle, they fought for 4 hours. The Sardinians were accustomed to being easily defeated, but the Carthaginians long kept it an indecisive battle. Finally, when all that was to be seen as Sardinians being slaughtered or in flight, the Carthaginians too were routed. But As they turned to run, the Romans cut them off by wheeling around the wing with which they had driven back the Sardinians. After that it was more a bloodbath than a battle. 12,000 of the enemy Sardinians and Carthaginians alike were cut down and some 3,700 taken prisoner, with the capture of 27 military standards. 41. What more than anything made the battle famous and memorable was the capture of the commander Hasdrubal, and of the Carthaginian nobles Hanno and Mago. Mago belonged to the Barca clan, and was closely related to Hannibal, while Hanno had been responsible for the Sardinian defection, and was unquestionably the man who had fomented that war. But the fates that overtook the Sardinian leaders contributed no less to the fame of that particular engagement. Hampsicora's son Hostus died on the field of battle. Hampsicora made off with a few horsemen, but when he received the news that in addition to the defeat his son was also dead, he committed suicide. And at night, so no one would intervene and thwart his plan. Hampsicora's son Hostus died on the field of battle. Hampsicora made off with a few horsemen, but when he received the news that in addition to the defeat his son was also dead, he committed suicide. And at night, so no one would intervene and thwart his plan. For the others, the town of Cornus again provided shelter in their flight, as it had done before, but Manlius attacked it with his victorious army and reduced it in a few days. After that, other city-states had gone over to Hampsicora, and the Carthaginians also gave hostages and capitulated. Manlius imposed payments of tribute and grain on them, assessed according to their strength or the extent of their transgressions, and then led his army back to Corales. At Corales he launched his warships and embarked on them the soldiers he had brought with him, after which he sailed to Rome and announced to the Senate that Sardinia had been completely subdued. He also delivered the tribute to the quaestors, the grain to the aediles, and the prisoners of war to the praetor Quintus Fulvius. In the same period, the praetor Titus Autosilius sailed across to Africa from Lilybaeum and pillaged the farmland of Carthage, heading from there to Sardinia. There were reports of Hasdrubal's recent crossing to the island from the Balearics. He encountered the fleet of Hasdrubal as it was returning to Africa. There was a minor engagement on the open sea in which Autosilius captured 7 ships with their crews, and panic scattered the other enemy vessels far and wide, just like a storm. It so happened that during that time, too, Bomilcar arrived in Locri with troops, elephants, and provisions sent as reinforcements from Carthage to take him by surprise. Appius Claudius swiftly led his army to Messana, on the pretense of doing the rounds of his province, and then, wind and tide being with him, crossed to Locri. Bomilcar, however, had already left to join Hanno in Bruttium, and Lucrians closed their gates on the Romans. Appius headed back to Messana, with nothing to show for his great effort. That same summer, Marcellus made repeated forays out of Nola, which he was occupying with a garrison, into the farmlands of the Hirpini, and against the Samnites of Caudium. Such was the havoc he wreaked everywhere with fire and the sword, that he revived in Samnium memories of its disasters of old. "42. As a result, representatives from both tribes were immediately sent to Hannibal, and they made the following address to the Carthaginian. Hannibal, we at first stood on our own as enemies of the Roman people, for as long as our own arms and resources were sufficient to give us protection. When we came to have little confidence in these, we made an alliance with King Pyrrhus. Abandoned by him, we accepted a peace treaty that was forced upon us, and we stuck to that for well nigh 50 years, up to the time when you came to Italy. Your courage and success won our hearts, but no less so did your singular courtesy and graciousness towards our citizens, whom you returned to us after capturing them. So much so, in fact, that if you, our friend, were safe and sound, we had no fear, not merely of the Roman people, but even of the wrath of the gods, if I may say so without offending them. But now you have actually been not only safe and victorious, but you have been present with us, able almost to hear the weeping of our wives and children, and to see our homes ablaze. And yet, for heaven's sake, we have at times this summer suffered such devastation that one would think that it was Marcus Marcellus who prevailed at Cannae, not Hannibal. And the Romans are now boasting that you had strength only to strike one blow, and that your sting is spent and you are powerless. We waged a war with the Romans for a century, receiving no assistance from any foreign general or army, except for a 2-year period, when it was a case of Pyrrhus using our soldiers to augment his forces rather than using his forces to defend us. I shall not boast of our triumphs, of the 2 consuls and 2 consular armies that we sent beneath the yoke, and of all our successes and accomplishments. As for the difficulties and adversities that befall us then, we can speak of those now with less resentment than we can of what is happening to us today. Great dictators would invade our territory with their masters of horse, the 2 consuls with their consular armies. They would conduct reconnaissance and post reserve troops, and then lead their men in regular order to plunder our land. But now we are the prey of a singular praetor, and of a tiny garrison left to defend Nola. They came not even grouped in companies, but like bandits, overrunning our territory from end to end as nonchalantly as if they were roaming through the farmlands of Rome. And this is the explanation. You are not protecting us, and our own young men, who would be defending us, if they were at home, are all serving in your forces. I would be showing ignorance of you and your army if I did not say that it would be easy for you to crush these itinerant marauders, these men wandering around in disorder, each drawn by hope, no matter how illusory, of gaining plunder. For I know about all the Roman armies that have been defeated and routed by you. Those men will fall prey to the few Numidians, and you will have sent us support and simultaneously taken it from Nola. But only if you consider those people whom you thought worthy to be your allies to be also not unworthy of your defense and protection. 43. Hannibal's response to these remarks was that the Harpini and Samnites were doing everything at the same time, appraising him of their losses, asking for military assistance, and complaining of being undefended and neglected. What they should have done was to appraise him of the losses first, then taken the step of requesting aid, and only in the event of their request going nowhere should they finally have complained that their appeals for help had been in vain. He was not going to lead his army into the land of the Harpini and Samnites, he said, for fear of making himself a burden on those peoples, but he would take it into the closest areas belonging to the allies of the Roman people. By pillaging these lands, he would satisfy his own men's hunger for spoils, and also create fear such as would keep the enemy at a distance from his allies. As for the war with Rome, if the battle of Trasimene outshone the Trebia, and if Cannae outshone Trasimene, he was going to win a greater and more brilliant victory that would eclipse even the memory of Cannae. He sent the envoys off with this answer and some splendid gifts. Then, leaving a small garrison on the Tafada mountains, he set off in person with the rest of his army, and advanced to Nola. Leaving Brutium, Hanno also came to Nola, bringing reinforcements that had been shipped from Carthage, and a number of elephants. Establishing his camp not far from the town, Hannibal investigated the situation and discovered everything to be very different from the reports he had received from the representatives of his allies. Marcellus' conduct had been such that he could not be said to have left anything to chance or recklessly to have given the enemy any leeway. His raids had come after careful reconnoitering and were conducted with strong supporting troops, and he always had his retreat assured. All precautionary measures had been carefully taken, as if he had been facing Hannibal in person. At that time, aware of the enemy's approach, Marcellus kept his forces within the fortifications, and he instructed the senators of Nola to walk along the walls and examine all enemy activity in the neighborhood. Hanno now approached the city wall and invited two of these senators, Herennius Bassus and Herius Petius, to parley. When they came forth, with Marcellus's permission, Hanno addressed them through an interpreter. He praised Hannibal for his bravery and good fortune in war, and denigrated the greatness of Rome, which he had said was on the decline along with her strength. And even if that former equality between the two powers were still there, he continued the allies and had nevertheless discovered how oppressive Roman dominion was, and how lenient Hannibal had been even to all his prisoners of war of Italian birth. They should therefore choose to have a friendship and alliance with Carthage rather than with Rome. Even if the two consuls were at Nola with their armies, he continued, they would still be no match for Hannibal than they had been at Cannae, and much less would a single praetor be able to defend Nola with a few raw recruits. It made more difference to the people of Nola than it did to Hannibal whether the Carthaginian took their town by force or by surrender. For take it he would, just as he had taken Capua and Nuceria. But the difference between the fate of Capua and that of Nuceria, they, as Nolans, well knew for themselves, being more or less placed between the two. He did not wish to predict what would befall their city if it were captured. Rather, he was making a commitment to them that, if they surrendered, Marcellus and his garrison, along with Nola, they had no one else, would dictate the terms on which they would enter into an alliance and compact of friendship with Hannibal. 44. In reply, Herennius Bassus observed that the bond of friendship between the peoples of Rome and Nola had existed for many years, and that to that day neither party had reason to regret it. If the people of Nola ought to have changed their loyalties as fortunes changed, he added, it was now simply too late for the change. And if they were going to surrender to Hannibal, why would they have bothered sending for a Roman garrison? They had fully thrown in their lot with those who had come to defend them, and that is how it would be to the end. The parley moved any hope Hannibal might have had of taking Nola through betrayal, and he surrounded the town with a cordon of troops for a simultaneous attack on the walls from all directions. When Marcellus saw that Hannibal had moved up close to the walls, he drew up his fighting line within the gate and launched a defending counterattack from the town. A number of the enemy were taken by surprise and killed at the first onset. Then there was a rush to the scene of the fighting, and when both sides' forces evened up, it began to turn into a ferocious struggle, one that would have been memorable as few others had been, had not torrential rain arrived with gale-force winds to part the combatants. In fact, however, the day saw the Romans return to the city, and the Carthaginians to their camp, after only a minor tussle, which merely served to stimulate both sides. Even so, there were losses, no more than 30 on the Carthaginian side, those taken by surprise in the initial counterattack, and 50 on that of the Romans. The rain persisted without a break throughout the night, until the 3rd hour of the following day, and so, although both sides were eager for the fight, they nevertheless kept within their fortifications that day. The following day, Hannibal sent a section of his troops out to conduct predatory raids on Nolan farmland. Observing this, Marcellus straightway led out his troops to form a battle line, and Hannibal did not decline the offer of combat. There was a distance of about a mile between the city and the camp, and it was in this space, Nola is completely surrounded by flat land, that they engaged. The shout that arose from both sides brought back those who were closest to the fighting in the cohorts that had gone out to raid the fields, and they joined the battle that was already in progress. The men of Nola also came to reinforce the Roman line. After applauding their action, Marcellus instructed them to remain in reserve and bear the wounded from the field, but to keep out of the fighting unless they received a signal from him. 45. The battle hung in the balance, with the generals spurring on their men, and the soldiers fighting with all their might. Marcellus told the Romans to put pressure on men they had defeated 2 days before and chased from Cumae a few days earlier, men whom he had himself, with other troops, driven from Nola the previous year. Not all the enemy were on the battlefield, he told them. Some were roaming the fields in raiding parties, but those in the battle were drained of their strength by excesses in Campania, exhausted from a whole winter of drinking, womanizing, and all manner of depravity. Gone was their renowned ferocity. Gone was their renowned ferocity and vitality, he said, and lost that physical and mental toughness that enabled them to scale the heights of the Pyrenees and the Alps. These were the remnants of that band of men, and they were having difficulty holding their weapons and standing up to fight. Capua had been Hannibal's Cannae. He declared it was there that the Carthaginians' military prowess had been snuffed out, along with their military discipline, their fame of old, and their hopes for the future. While Marcellus was trying to boost his men's morale with these disparaging comments on the enemy, Hannibal was using much harsher language to chasten his men. He recognized his soldiers' arms and standards, he said. They were the same that he had seen and put into use at the Trebia, at Trasimene, and finally at Cannae. But he added, it was one army that he had taken into winter quarters at Capua, and another that he had taken out. You are men whom 2 consular armies could never withstand, he told them. Are you finding it hard, despite all your efforts, to face up to a Roman lieutenant and to do battle with a single legion and a cavalry squadron? Is Marcellus getting away with attacking us yet again, and with recruits and Nolan reservists? Where is the soldier of mine who dragged the consul Gaius Flaminius from his mount and walked off with his head? Where is the man who killed Lucius Paulus at Cannae? Are your swords now blunted? Are your sword hands grown weak? Or is this some other strange phenomenon? You were a handful of men used to defending superior numbers. Now that you have the greater numbers, are you unable to take on a handful? You used to boast that you would take Rome by storm if someone led you there. You were brave in your language. But look, this is a lesser task in which I want to test your drive and your courage. Storm Nola. It is a city on the plains with no protection from a river or the sea. I shall take you from here, or I will follow you wherever you want, once you are loaded with the plunder and spoils from this affluent town. 46. No words of encouragement or reproach could re-establish the morale of the Carthaginians. They were driven back in every quarter, and Roman confidence rose, thanks partly to their commander's encouragement, but thanks also to the citizens of Nola, who spurred them to fight with shouts of support. The Carthaginians turned tail and were driven back into their camp. The Roman soldiers were eager to assault the camp, but Marcellus led them back to Nola, to the sound of rejoicing and applause, which came from the commons, who had earlier favored the Carthaginians. More than 5,000 of the enemy were killed that day, and 600 were taken alive. 19 military standards were also captured, and 2 elephants for having fallen in the battle. Roman losses were fewer than 1,000. The 2 sides spent the following day observing an undeclared truce and burying comrades who were killed in the field. Marcellus burned the enemy spoils in fulfillment of a vow to Vulcan. 2 days later, disgruntled over something, presumably or else hoping for better pay for their service, 272 cavalrymen, a mixture of Numidians and Spaniards, deserted to Marcellus. The Romans subsequently made frequent use of their staunch and loyal support in that war, and after the war, in recognition of their valor, these men were awarded grants of land, the Spaniards in Spain and the Numidians in Africa. Hannibal then sent Hanno back from Nola to Bruttium with the troops with which he had come, and he himself headed for winter quarters in Apulia, where he encamped close to Arpi. On hearing that Hannibal had left for Apulia, Quintus Fabius transported grain from Nola and Neapolis to the camp above Suassola. He strengthened the camp's fortifications, left a force sufficient to hold the position through the winter, and moved his camp closer to Capua. He now wreaked destruction on the farmlands of Capua with fire and the sword until the Capuans, despite an almost total lack of confidence in their strength, were forced to come forth from their gates and establish a fortified camp on the open terrain before their city. The Capuans had 6,000 men under arms. Their infantry was ineffectual, and they had more strength in their cavalry, and so it was by initiating cavalry engagements that they challenged their enemy. Amongst the many noted Campanian horsemen was one Serenus Vibellius, whose surname was Doria. He was a citizen of Capua, and was by far the strongest horseman of the Campanians, so much so that, when he was serving with the Romans, only a single Roman, Claudius Acellus, had been able to match his reputation for horsemanship. This Torreia now spent a long time riding up to the enemy cavalry squadrons and running his eyes over them. Finally, when silence fell, he asked where Claudius Acellus was. The two of them had been in the habit of arguing about their abilities in the field. He explained, and he wondered why Acellus would not now let the sword decide the issue, conceding the spolia opima if he were defeated, and taking them if he had won. "47. When this was reported to Acellus in camp, he waited only long enough to ask the consul's permission to leave the ranks to fight the foe who was ensuing the challenge. Then, with the consul's approval, he immediately seized his weapons, rode forward in front of the enemy guard post, and called on Torreia by name, telling him to come and face him wherever he wished. By now the Romans had come crowding out to view the fight, and the people of Capua had filled all the space, not just on the earthworks of their camp, but even on the walls of the city to see it. The combatants' earlier boast had provided great publicity for the event, and now, spears poised, they spurred on their mounts. But as they weaved and dodged in the open space, they were only dragging out the fight without injury. This was going to be a test of horses, not of horsemen, the Campanian then said to the Roman. Unless we take the horses from the level ground and head them down into the sunken road just here, there we shall have no room for avoiding each other, and we shall come to grips. Almost before the words were out, Claudius galloped his horse down into the road, but Torreia's words were braver than his actions. "No thanks, nag, and ditch don't mix," he said, an expression that was thereafter passed down as a country proverb. Claudius covered a great distance on the sunken road, and failing to encounter any enemy, rode up again to the level ground, uttering words of reproach for his enemy's cowardice. He then returned triumphant to camp amid jubilant cheering and shouts of congratulation. To this equestrian duel there is added, in some accounts, a detail that is to say the least amazing. though how true it is we must all judge for ourselves. Torreya, these claim, fled back to the city with Claudius in pursuit. Claudius rode in through one of the enemy's gates, which was open and excited unhurt by a second gate, leaving the enemy speechless at the astonishing event. 48. After that the camp remained at peace. The consul even withdrew his force to let the companions get on with their crop planting, and did not harm their land again until the grain in the fields was high and able to provide him with fodder. He then transported that fodder to the Castra Claudiana above Suessella, where he constructed winter quarters. He gave the order to the proconsul Marcus Claudius to keep at Nola only the force essential for the city's protection, and to send his other troops back to Rome so they would not burden the allies and be an expense for the state. In addition, Tiberius Gracchus led his legions from Cumae to Luceria in Apulia, and from there dispatched to Brundisium the praetor Marcus Valerius at the head of the army that he had commanded at Luceria. Valerius's orders were to patrol the coastline of Salentine territory and take such precautionary measures as were necessary in regard to Philip and the Macedonian War. As the summer of the events I have just narrated came to an end, a dispatch arrived from Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, with news of their very important and very successful campaigns in Spain. But the letter continued, there was need of cash and their men's pay, and the army stood in need of clothing and food rations, and the naval crews in need of everything. In the matter of pay, they said, they would find some way of extracting it from the Spaniards, if the treasury were depleted, but everything else certainly had to be sent from Rome, and without it, maintaining either the army or the province was an impossibility. When the dispatch was read out, there was not a single senator who did not accept the veracity of the report and the fairness of the requests. But they were aware, too, of the large number of land and naval forces they were keeping in service, and of the size of the new fleet they had to equip in the near future, should there be war with Macedon. They realized that Sicily and Sardinia had, before the war, paid tribute into the treasury, and that now they could barely afford the upkeep of the armies patrolling those provinces. The war tax had helped defray expenses, but the number contributing that tax had been reduced by the enormous losses at both Lake Trasimene and Cannae. If the few survivors of those battles were burdened with an exponential increase in payment, they would be claimed by another kind of ruin. The public could not survive on its resources, they concluded. It would have to survive on credit. They decided that the praetor Fulvius should go to the public assembly and make clear to the people the needs of the state. Fulvius was then to urge those people who had increased their personal wealth through public contracts to grant the state extra time for repayment, since the state was responsible for their increased wealth, and to take on contracts for supplying all essential materials for the army in Spain. The contracts would be issued on the understanding that the contractors would be the first to be paid when there was money in the treasury. The praetor delivered his speech in the assembly and specified a date on which he would put out contracts for furnishing the Spanish army. with clothes and grain, and meeting all the other needs of the naval crews. "49. When that day arrived, 3 companies, each made up of 19 individuals, showed up to bid for the contracts. They had 2 requests. First, that they be exempted from military service while they were engaged in this public service. And secondly, that the cargoes they shipped be insured by the Commonwealth against risks from enemy attack and bad weather. When both requests were granted, the companies accepted the contracts, and state business was conducted with private funding. Such was the character and such the patriotism that obtained more or less uniformly throughout the city's classes. The scrupulousness with which the contracts were fulfilled matched the magnanimity with which they were taken on, and the soldiers were as well provisioned in every aspect as if their support came from a well-stocked treasury, as in the past. At the time that these supplies arrived, the town of Illiturgi was under attack from Hasdrubal, from Mago, and from Hannibal, son of Bomilcar, because it had gone over to the Romans, making their way between these 3 enemy camps. The Scipios put up a great fight to reach their allies, cities inflicting heavy losses on those standing in their way. They brought grain, which was in short supply in the town, and they urged the inhabitants in defending their walls to show the same spirit as they had seen in the Roman army that had been fighting on their behalf. They then advanced to launch an attack on the largest of the 3 camps, the one under Hasdrubal's command. The 2 other Carthaginian leaders and their 2 armies also converged on the same spot, for they perceived it to be where the whole issue was being decided. The engagement began with a charge from the camp. The enemy had 60,000 in the battle that day, while there were about 16,000 on the Roman side, and yet the victory was far from indecisive. The Romans cut down the enemy in numbers greater than they were actually fielding themselves. They took more than 3,000 prisoners and captured slightly fewer than 1,000 horses. Also taken were 59 military standards and 7 elephants, 5 having been killed in the engagement. And that day the Romans took possession of the 3 enemy camps. With the siege of Illiturgi raised, the Carthaginian armies were marched overland to assault Intibilli. Supplementary troops had been raised from the province, for it had a greater appetite for war than any other, provided that plunder or payment were in the offing, and it then had an abundance of men of serviceable age. Once more there was a pitched battle, which again yielded the same result for the 2 sides. More than 13,000 of the enemy were killed, and more than 2,000 taken prisoner, with 42 standards and 9 elephants captured. At that point, nearly all the tribes of Spain went over to the Romans, and the operations in Spain that summer were far more impressive than those in Italy. End of Book 23.